welcome back to the Worldlands podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, and today we are joined by Alex Koff, a partner at Venable who specializes in international law with corporate litigation and regulatory legal experience. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So today we're going to be talking about tariffs, specifically the tariffs proposed by President Donald Trump within the first few weeks of his time in office. This is a fast-moving story, but as the time of this recording, the situation is as follows. On March 4th, tariffs on steel and aluminum will be raised to 25% without exceptions or exemptions. Proposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada are currently paused for 30 days after each country took steps to address the president's concerns over border control. This is just from the U.S. side. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs on American goods, and there's also a pause on that. Other countries are certainly considering their next actions. That's a lot to go through, and the situation is regularly evolving. So, Alex, let's start with a very basic question. What is the legal definition of a tariff? Is it considered a tax, an extra charge?
Yeah, I suppose that's a great question to start with. A tariff is basically a tax that's imposed by a government of a country on a particular product or an item, and the person that pays that, from a legal definition standpoint, is what's called the importer of record, the person who files the piece of paper or documentation importing that product into the U.S.
Okay. So you basically just answered my next question, which was who actually pays for it. But, I've seen a lot of commentary that states that American people end up paying for it. But is that technically accurate given what you just said?
So technically, the responsible party in the eyes of the government is that importer of record, who's ever listed on those import documents. But I mean, we're on a podcast, and we need to put this in plain, simple terms so that people can understand what's going on. And I think you're probably asking me, who are the winners and the losers? Who are the people who are actually paying the tariff at the end of the day? Is it the U.S. consumer, which is what everybody's talking about? And I think that it ultimately comes down as a trickle down. The people who are going to be paying the tariff at the end of the day, because the importer of record will bring in whatever the product is, and that product will be paid at a higher cost, so the prices will ultimately go up downstream. So consumers ultimately will pay that in a higher tax downstream. The people who will likely get it first will be the U.S. manufacturers who import, or if it's a bulk item like a steel product, or if it's a particular product that they're using in their production in the U.S., their prices will be higher, and they're going to have to either keep their prices at the same level, or they're going to have to increase them. And that's where the consumers are going to be taxed as well. That's who's paying it, at least on the U.S. side. And indirectly down the line, and I may be going ahead from where your questions may be, ultimately, U.S. companies, if they're exporting and they're facing retaliatory tariffs, will also have to face that trade war, which is why people have some problems.
So does the president have legal authority to raise and lower tariffs at his will?
Yes, the president has a couple of different authorities at his disposal to do that. And there are also other rules that govern how the United States deals with tariffs. So the president has his constitutional authority under Article 2 to protect the nation and to be the force in international affairs. The Congress controls, under Article 1 of the Constitution, the ability to control the purse strings of the U.S. government. So the Congress will bind tariffs and have different rates that go along with them. The issue here is when the president, I think, imposed tariffs, because this isn't the first time that the president imposed tariffs. Under his first term, he imposed tariffs against China, and he went through a process that was enumerated in statute. So he followed something called Section 301, Section 232, and Section 201, of the Trade Act. And basically what happened was there was a investigation, and then the president installed the tariffs based off of the investigation in response to what was found through that investigation.
Okay.
Here, for the new tariffs, the president is using a different mechanism, and that mechanism is there's two things that he's really citing. He's citing the National Emergencies Act, called the NEA, and he's citing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is IEEPA, IEEPA. And by doing that, he's doing two things. Number one, you don't have to go through the significant investigation, and then you're not tying the increase in the tariffs to the report that you found that's grounded in the statute. Instead, it gives you the ability to impose those tariffs and raise them much more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing it in response to two things, because he's grinding it in international, the international economic business world. He's saying that's critical to our national defense. And he's also saying two things with the northern and the southern borders. He's saying that fentanyl imports coming into the U.S. are a threat to our national security, and immigration at the southern border is a threat, and that Canada isn't doing enough as well to sort of quell actions by Mexican gangs and so forth. So he's using a national security angle to do that, which is new.
So speaking of Canada, when the Canadian tariffs were initially announced, I saw that certain provinces took action separately to counteract them, announcing changes in contracts, mentioning alcohol. Is there something specific states could do?
So this is really a federal issue. I think that consumers can look at what their supply chains are and what their sourcings are, but I think that a lot of businesses are waiting right now, because in the first Trump administration, with the tariffs that were imposed against China, people were
Mm-hmm.
onshoring supply lines. They were moving them out of China to third country markets. I think people are waiting because it's a significant disruption, and we are, you know, two administrations essentially away from that. And people are still trying to reel and figure out how they can avoid those initial Chinese tariffs. With the tariffs against Mexico and Canada, which are our largest trading partners, it
Right.
would be a significant lift to re-onshore everything in a month. It's just not, I think, possible. But I think people, in response to your question, will look at how they can avoid the tariffs by bringing things into the U.S. for production, if it's possible, if the supply chain permits it. And that, I think, is one of the long-term goals of this administration, is to avoid reliance on, certainly in critical areas and for critical supply chain issues, on foreign production.
Okay. So, the U.S. has been a member of the World Trade Organization since '95. Is there something that WTO has any power or sway here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The WTO was formed in 1995. It was
Mm-hmm.
really formed from the Bretton Woods agreements just after World War II, and there was never a formal signed agreement. It used to be called the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, and it was called the GATT in 1994, which were the final agreements. So there is a history of, action and some dispute settlement precedents that happened
Mm-hmm.
before. Technically, there's no precedent at the WTO, but that's getting too legal for our purposes. What you should know is, like we talked about before, this is different, and the president is really citing national security issues, and that's never been done before. And at the WTO, there's an exception. That exception is Article 21, which is the national security exception. And traditionally, when there are dispute settlement cases that involved issues that a member, or a contracting party under the GATT, said was a national security issue, the WTO didn't really have good mechanisms to deal with it. And
Okay.
so, couching these tariffs as national security measures makes it much harder at the WTO, and it also makes it much harder in U.S. cases that challenge the president's authority. Right. So we can go into that issue too, if that'd be helpful.
So wait, do the tariffs change or violate or invalidate something like the USMCA agreement? I mean, Trump signed it during his first term.
So no, it doesn't. I mean, so the way tariffs are bound through successive rounds of negotiations
Mm-hmm.
from when the GATT was formed and then went into the WTO. People, members, contracting parties to the WTO, negotiated and said, all right, I will lower my tariff on pick an item, soybeans, if you give me greater access to your economy, and you lower it on automobile imports, whatever it may be, just as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And then they bind the tariff rate. So if the US rate was 18% back in 1955 as a general matter across all goods, today it's a relatively porous border. It's maybe 2%. So the US has really lowered its tariffs all the way down, and we let goods come in, and we did that in exchange for this globalization where we can get access to other markets. There are mechanisms where you can go above that rate, but the rate is indeed bound, and that's what the published rate is. And that, when the president institutes these new tariff measures, he's grounding it in an authority that allows an exception to the WTO or allows an exception to the USMCA. And so
Okay.
he's not violating those clauses by doing this, by couching it in national security grounds, but it's considered a temporary measure. And when that measure goes away, the bound rate remains.
Hmm. So if I'm a business owner and I see these new tariffs, which steps should I start taking to avoid them? Am I looking for, specifically domestic suppliers now? Are there certain countries or partners that aren't likely to be hit with the tariffs?
That's also a really good question. I think let's start with an overall view of how the president views these. I think
Mm-hmm.
the president is looking at Canada, Mexico, and China and saying these tariffs are going to hurt Canada, Mexico, and China more than they're going to hurt us, and this will be a leverage point. So if you look at, and this is from the White House fact sheet that when they issued the tariffs, they quoted that Canada's trade accounts for 67% of Canada's GDP. It accounts for 73% of Mexico's GDP and 37% of China's GDP. In contrast, it only accounts for 24% of US GDP. So
Hmm.
the president is using these trade measures, these tariffs, as a leverage point to try and encourage a change in behavior from these other countries. So the president has threatened and has hinted that he's going to look to institute tariffs against some other countries. Some of the some of those other countries are the European Union, the BRICS members. BRICS is BRICS, and it stands for Brasilia, Russia, India, China. But he's also looked at South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and some others. And it's unclear yet what he's going to do in those areas. So, in response to your question about what people can do on the ground today to reduce the impact of the tariffs. Some of the things are number one, under the first Trump administration, there was an exclusion process where products were excluded from the tariffs. Currently, the tariffs that have been proposed under the Trump 2.0 administration have not had an exclusion possibility. So that's
Mm-hmm.
not an option, but I think people should keep an eye out to see whether or not there's going to be a mechanism or an ability to exclude their goods and explain why. At least in the
Mm-hmm.
prior administration, the standard was two part. Number one, the administration took very great care to try and understand, number one, how can we create pressure on companies in the area where we're imposing the tariffs? So how can we encourage Chinese companies to lobby their own government to remove the offending measure? And in the China Section 301 tariffs under Trump 1, that was theft of intellectual property. And
Mm-hmm.
then the second issue was, how are these tariff measures going to impact small and medium-sized businesses in the United States? And
Mm-hmm.
based on those two, discussion points, the administration, the U.S. folks, USTR, and many other interagency committee folks looked at filings that people made and said, yeah, this is going to harm us more than it's going to really help. So we're going to try and exempt. In this second go around, there hasn't been that ability to apply, but
Mm-hmm.
that remains to be seen whether they're going to institute something like that. The second thing that they can do is perhaps go through their supply chains and talk with their advisors and figure out whether there's a way, as you identified, to source from
Mm-hmm.
other places that are currently not affected by the tariffs or impacted by the tariffs. These are
Hmm.
moving quickly. So some of these things came in the trade world, almost overnight. But understand your supply chain and where you can onshore, which is, I think, the goal ultimately of what the administration is trying to do, may be helpful.
Okay. So let's say all of this plays out in the most negative way possible. Prices go up for everybody. Life gets harder than it is. Is there a way to remove the tariffs? So, is there a way to remove the tariffs that does not rely on the president? Could Congress or courts do anything?
There can be challenges, and this goes to what I was saying before between the Trump 1 administration with the Section
Mm-hmm.
301, 232, and 201 actions, and these new tariffs under the NEA and IEPA. So there can be judicial challenges. It's going to be a higher road because as actions are taken under this new administration to under these new proposed tariffs to challenge the tariffs, it's really going to be in the sphere of national security, which is much more in the president's authority, and there's much more deference by the courts. So it's a higher
Mm-hmm.
uphill battle, generally from a legal perspective, to challenge.
Mm.
If you're challenging a statute that Congress drafted where the president is basing his authority on that statute, then the courts will look at whether or not the president's action complies with the terms of that statute. And so it's a little
Okay.
bit more open to challenge. And you saw that with the China tariffs. It was appealed to the Court of International Trade. The Court of International Trade sided with the government. That got appealed to the appellate court, called the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And that within the last month or two was heard by the appellate court at oral argument. It's been fully briefed, and they're going to make a decision on whether or not those tariffs comply with the terms of the statute. And I was at the oral argument, and much of the discussion turned on the terms of the statutes and did the president's actions through the agencies comply with those terms. In these new tariff actions, it's based much more on the president's authority. And there's to put this in perspective that people sort of understand, there's a famous case from 1953 called Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And Justice Jackson from the Supreme Court issued a concurring opinion that sort of encapsulates this. And he sort of set it out like a stoplight with a red, yellow, and green.
Mm-hmm.
And the red light was, look, when the president acts pursuant to an express or implied authorization of Congress, his authority is at its maximum. And so if Congress speaks to the issue and the president then exercises his constitutional authority in accordance with that, it's going to be very hard for a court to overturn that.
Right.
Sort of that medium zone is when the president acts in absence of either a congressional grant or denial of authority. They call it a zone of twilight, in which the president and Congress may have concurrent authority. They each have a hand in it. So if there's inertia from Congress, indifference, acquiescence, that may sometimes enable the presidential action, but it makes judicial review harder, right, to overturn it. And then the third, which is, they call it the lowest ebb, when the president takes measures incompatible with the express or implied will of Congress, the president's power is at its lowest ebb, and the president can only rely on the powers granted to the executive branch, minus any constitutional powers of Congress that exist over the matter. So the court can sustain or exclusive presidential control in such a case, but it makes it much harder in those instances. And I think here, with the president citing in his executive orders two existing statutes, the NEA and the NIEPA. IEPA's never been used for trade actions like this. But if Congress has inertia and you have that twilight zone, it makes it harder to challenge it. And I think the president may argue that this is something pursuant to an express or implied authorization of Congress, if they sort of move forward with this and there's bills that are passed, supporting what the president is doing. So I think it's more of an uphill battle compared to the initial trade actions. And I think you need to rely on the president at this point to change his mind and stay the actions like he did with the 30-day by getting concessions with Mexico and Canada, and like he did with Colombia prior to instituting those two tariff actions. And remember, the China actions on 10% are going forward, and they're proceeding. There doesn't seem to be an indication on those that the executive orders and that the duties would apply to goods that originate in Hong Kong and Macau. The first administration under President Trump collapsed Hong Kong into China and took away the Hong Kong independent status, but it's unclear, and we haven't seen anything yet in the executive orders that the extra 10% would apply to imports from those two countries. And Hong Kong is still a separate independent customs territory under the WTO. So that's just an outstanding question.
Okay. So President Trump likes to talk a lot about winners and losers when it comes to deals. Based on the reaction to these tariffs, could you say that the U.S. is a winner or a loser in this situation?
So it depends who you're talking to. I think that President Trump in his first stroke of the pen on his first day put forth an America First trade policy, and that was an executive order and a memorandum that he passed. And he really talks about trade in that issue as a national security sword that he can wield and he's really trying to move America forward to protect American jobs and expand the economy. And this is reminiscent of what he said when he was talking as president in his first speech when he first was inaugurated and Trump won. It's the same themes that came through. But in terms of winners or losers, some of the economists who are talking will look at numbers and look at jobs, and they'll claim that overall, netting things out, the tariffs may be difficult for the U.S. For instance, there was a a think tank in Washington that recently came out with a policy, and they talked about how taxes, and just to take steel as an example, that it created something like 8,700 jobs and generated some 2.4 billion in pre-tax profits for steel firms. But on the flip side, the domestic industries buying steel in the US paid 5.6 billion because of the protection, and that cost about $650,000 for each job that was created in the steel industry. So if you're looking at numbers, there's a lot of deadweight loss that occur with tariffs from a macroeconomic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're looking at overall national security, people will say that we're now onshoring an industry that's essential for our security going forward. And now we have a stronger steel industry than we did before. And we're reducing our reliance. So it's not a simple question to say who is going, whether the tariffs are going to be good or bad. Clearly, the president believes that they are going to be a very strong component of making a stronger U.S. But a lot of people may pay a higher economic price for it in ultimately downstream goods, consumers, and so forth. And like I
Right.
said earlier in the talk, I think U.S. exporters of products may be facing retaliatory tariffs as well from
Mm-hmm.
people, and so it may be harder for them to sell their goods abroad, putting everything else aside, if they receive retaliatory tariffs from the countries that are hit by the U.S. tariffs.
It's a complicated topic.
It's a complicated topic, yeah. Look, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and we jumped into this podcast quickly, very soon after the tariffs were issued. To take a stock take, you have goods coming in from China from the Trump one tariffs, and there are four lists. So lists 1, 2, and 3, if your goods are on them, you well know you're hit at a 25% increase in tariffs,
Mm-hmm.
and list 4 is a 7.5% currently. And what they did is they tried to insulate consumers as much as possible and really hit B2B goods in lists one and two. And then when they ran out of other goods in lists 3 and list 4, they moved more to B2C. So they're trying to
Mm-hmm.
reduce the amount and the impact on the consumers. In Trump 2, what they're doing is they threatened Colombia. That was resolved in favor, so that never got implemented. There were tariffs that went into place against Canada and Mexico, and those are also paused for a 30-day period. And the China tariffs went in at an additional 10%, and those have not been paused, so those are there. And if you're a business and you're looking at all of this and you're seeing increased numbers, how do you deal with it? You deal with it by paying attention to what's going on, being involved with your supply chain, and understand where you're sourcing from, understanding where the importer of record is going to try to likely pass down those costs. And if you have a very small margin that you have to make up, if you what we saw in the first go round was that when manufacturers and companies and entities could keep the cost from being passed down, they would. And then when they couldn't and it was just too expensive, we saw increased pricing. And so that may be something that we as an economy may be facing.
So you mentioned kind of staying informed. Are there any specific sources that we should be looking at to kind of break it down a little further for us?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can give a plug for WTCI and everything that you're putting out. That's the news articles that you sort of push out, and the information, and all the really smart people who are on staff there would be great resources
Mm-hmm.
for companies as they're looking at this. People at Venable, not to give a unfair plug to Venable, but we're following these issues obviously pretty closely, and
Mm-hmm.
we're happy to field questions and give some guidance and advice. I've received, obviously, as you can imagine, a large number of phone calls from people who are interested in just that question. And
Yeah.
so we're staying on top of all of the stuff. We have a task force that's involved that's looking at it, as are other firms, I'm sure. And just being aware so that you can pivot and move. And if you can create a hot doc of files, so I've had conversations with the clients of saying, what is it that you have and how will these tariffs impact you? And maybe you should start thinking and tracking those questions that were involved in the Trump 1 administration.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the impact of small, medium-sized business? What will be the impact on your company in terms of workers and layoffs and jobs? And are you really going to struggle under these, and how so? And how can you link that to the specific measure? And if you can start thinking about that from an earlier perspective to get a jump on it, so that if there is an exclusion, if you can go and talk with folks on the Hill and talk with folks in the administration to explain why this should really be an issue for you, that may be something that would be, I think, helpful in the short term as things start to settle out. We don't know yet where the measures are, so we're really at the front end. But
Right.
I think just thinking through those issues may be helpful for you.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today, giving our listeners a little bit more insight about what's going on with the tariffs. Where can people get in touch with you if they want to connect?
Sure. So I'm at Venable in Baltimore, and I also have an office in Washington D.C. And so you can get a hold of me at my email if you wanted, which is akoff@venable.com. That's Alpha Kilo Oscar Foxtrot Foxtrot at Victor Echo November Alpha Bravo Lima Echo.com. And my telephone is 410-528-4623. 410-428-4623. And you can find me on the web at venable.com.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. Please visit us online at WTCI.org and WTC Institute on all social channels. I'll see you next time.